Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written. This show gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us, and we're going to dive deep today into some bizarre origins, surprising mechanics, and even the tiny fine print of some games that you know or may never have heard of. I'm your host, Troy, and joining me is my co-host, Max. Behind the scenes with us is our producer, Jay. Today's episode, we're diving into the RPG classic, The Legend of the Five Rings. This is a realm of high drama and intrigue in the lands of Rokugan.
So, to be more specific, we are going to be covering the 5th edition of this game, produced by Fantasy Flight Games.
Absolutely, and later inherited by Edge Studios, where it's sort of in a kind of limbo right now, but...
The publishing rights? Yeah, it's in a strange place, because there's officially discontinued the content for that. And so this is a complete game in heavy air quotes.
Exactly. But this is a personal favorite of mine. It's something that's it's really intriguing, both from the perspective of a setting as well as the mechanics in play. And I've played one session of this game. So I've got this to table before, but it is only the one time that I have played it. And it is this 5th edition, this current edition of The Legend of the Five Rings I've played.
Yeah. My own experience is I've made a character for one of your games.
Yep.
That didn't get used, but it was good at kind of getting me through the process of understanding the system. I'd also run the Genesis system for, strangely enough, like a homebrew Call of Cthulhu game. So I'm familiar with the idea of what I like to call picto dice.
Yes.
We'll get more into that later, but this doesn't use a conventional dice system. But it's not exclusive to L5R, which is the shorthand for Legend of the Five Rings.
So to give you some background, Legend of the Five Rings began as a collectible card game, a CCG, and this started off in 1995 by AEG, Alderac Entertainment Group. This CCG came sort of in the boom of CCGs, right? There was a lot on the market.
Yeah, it was a huge... I like to say that Magic the Gathering is the Kurt Cobain of the games industry, because it completely flipped everything, and things that were popular were suddenly not popular, and everyone thought that RPGs were going to die because everyone was putting their money into CCGs.
Yep, absolutely. Everyone was wearing flannel now.
Yep, exactly. It was a total scene change, and thankfully that didn't bear out as expected. In fact, it was grossly overinflated in a lot of ways. Yeah, one of these games, and arguably one of the most original offerings from this CCG boom, was the L5R card game.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that made it unique, and Matt Colville has a whole video about the specifics of this because he was there. I remember when I was younger seeing it on shelves and stuff like that.
Me too.
But I was buying Magic cards at the time, so I didn't see why I would want to dive into it. But then hearing about it later, I was like, oh, wow, that was something.
Yeah.
So an actual narrative was built out through the tournament play of this game. Now, that sounds weird, but you're like, oh, well, depending on how different tournaments ended and what clans, because this is a game set in a feudal, I guess it's basically feudal Japan as its core, and then it's got Mongolian and Chinese elements kind of added onto it.
Yeah.
It's an East Asian fantasy setting.
Yes.
But it's broken into these clans, and depending on what clans won in what tournaments, it would change the story such that they would actually make new cards in the subsequent releases based on the outcome of those tournaments, which is just wild to me.
So cool. Yeah, I really agree.
Yeah. The logistics of such a thing kind of boggle the mind, at least for me. I'm like, wow, like, how do you determine what clan won? Like, they must have had criteria. I'd be fascinated to see how it actually worked. There's probably a video out there explaining it.
Yeah, where's my documentary?
Yeah, right. So the success of that card game and the lore that was developed through the course of that. Oh, so the other thing about that card game was that it ran for, I think, 2 years, and then it was done. Like, it was designed to be a short-term narrative. So the whole point of it was to have this idea that it was going to be played over this course of time, and then it was going to end. And so in some ways, it was the most, not including Magic the Gathering, one of the most successful of these, I guess, because it completed its goal.
Yes, absolutely.
A role-playing game was developed in 1997. There's a weird relationship between that role-playing game and the development of a supplement for Dungeons & Dragons called Oriental Adventures for 2nd edition. There's some crossover there. And in the 2nd edition of Legend of the Five Rings, there's even, when it parallels the D20 movement, there is a D20 supplement series, essentially like an off-branch of 2nd edition L5R, which is a D20 version that is under the Oriental Adventures rule book, which is essentially like a alternate player's handbook. It's strange. That's where following the timeline of this gets a little loopy, but we're not talking about that. There is a core RPG that I don't know exactly in rules, but it's a bit more reminiscent in its overall outlook on, say, like a White Wolf game might be.
Mm-hmm.
So most subsequent editions up to this point end up using D10s. They use a target number system. I don't know if they innovate the idea of roll and keep dice, but there's certainly a system that uses that, where you have a number that determines how many dice you roll, and then one of those numbers, to say you have an attribute and a skill, the skill determines which numbers you keep. So adding a lot of bonuses doesn't necessarily mean it raises the odds of having good things happen, but it only allows you to keep so many outcomes. I know that sounds probably a little obscure. It's probably better to actually pick up one of these books and take a look. But
yeah, it wasn't until 2015 that Fantasy Flight Games, they picked up Legend of the Five Rings from AEG, and they relaunched it with both a LCG, a limited card game, that again ran for a specific period of time with limited releases. It was sort of a reiteration of what had been done back in the 90s. And then in 2018, the RPG was relaunched in this new 5th edition. Now, when Fantasy Flight Games relaunched it, they did what they had always done with these RPGs, or what they had started their journey with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition. And they transitioned from the use of the D10s, as we were just talking about in the 3rd and 4th editions of the game, to the Picto dice, as I like that term. Let's just go with that. And as we were talking before the show, I would say this is probably our favorite iteration of using that type of dice. And it also made that big change, right, to this type of image-based dice. But it did keep things like roll and keep. And it really dug its heels on the narrative-driven gameplay and using these custom dice. So there were some familiar aspects to what you would be used to as an L5R player. But these new dice, in many ways, allowed you to go deeper into the narrative and dramatic aspects of each role, which I find to be most rewarding.
So we're not making the argument that this is the best edition of L5R.
Yeah.
The argument we're making is that this is the best use of what is sometimes termed the Genesis system that Fantasy Flight put out.
Yeah.
Because it's more in keeping with the type of play that those dice produce. So I think maybe it's good that we take a bit of time to explain what that is.
Yeah, and those dice started with the 3rd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. They were later used in the Star Wars RPG, Edge of the Empire, the Age of Rebellion, and Force and Destiny. So those are the 3 titles they were used in for Star Wars, and now they make their appearance within Legend of the Five Rings. How these dice are unique is each facing doesn't have a numeric value, but instead has a symbol or series of symbols that you would interpret based on the context of the role and the rules in your book.
The following episode to this one is going to be all about dice systems and how dice play a role in the game, in games in general. But the short version is that the advantage to this is that you end up with a lot of interesting, varied outcomes. So you don't get binary results like pass-fail. You don't even get gradiated results. Well, that you do get gradiated results, but you also get alternative outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have good and bad things happening simultaneously within a roll that can then be determined, kind of like the way that like some kind of scrying augur would like throw bones and then consult the bones.
And that is one of the fun parts of the Genesis system, is being able to engage with the results in a more meaningful way. And like, in L5R, there's opportunity and strife in addition to your success roll.
Mm-hmm.
And there's both the critical success symbol and your regular success symbol. Opportunity is a yes and. So it's the and. What is the adjective you want to add? What is the approach to the circumstance that you want to use that is modified by this opportunity? And the more opportunity you get, the greater you can magnify that change. Whereas strife is different than the Star Wars RPG in that there's advantage, similar to opportunity, and then disadvantage, which is just a bad thing. Where in L5R, strife represents the emotional burden that you take on. So you may pass a check, but you take on strife, which is representative of emotional strain, which can result in mechanical penalties and emotional outbursts or breakdowns. And that's really important because Rokugan's social structure, its hierarchy, and the model of decorum in its society is all about this certain stoic reservation of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And this game puts you on that knife edge where you're trying to maintain both your outward appearance. And this is manifested in other mechanics in the game, such as honor and glory that were in prior editions that have been kept forward and expanded upon in this edition. But you're trying to maintain this face, and it's all about the cracks that start to form as the pressure of your situation mounts on you.
The one critical thing that starts to build up as you play the game is this idea that the mask will slip.
Yes.
And that sounds like a bad thing, and in many ways it is, but that's the fun of the game, is in the way that like going insane in Call of Cthulhu is the fun of the game.
Yes.
There's this inevitable idea that you will lose decorum and have to play out a situation where you make yourself vulnerable in a society where that is taboo.
Yes, 100%. And it can be a moment of social vulnerability. Like you could break face in a courtly sense, right? But it could also be in a fight,
Mm-hmm.
where you lose yourself and kind of just go over the top in a combat. So there's a lot of ways to interpret it. And I think that's the value of these Picto dice is in the interpretation. It's like you spend more time staring at them to come up with your outcome, but you can have arguably, and not in every case, but in many cases, a richer outcome for it.
So yeah, that sort of speaks to the exact challenge with this game, and it comes down to the expectation. And if you look at the other games that they tried to adapt into this, they have more or less success depending on how it's implemented and what the previous edition was.
Yeah.
There's a term that Troy and I were throwing around, and it applies to a lot of games at different times, I guess different IPs that have multiple editions.
Yes.
And it's what we've been sort of toying around with the idea of calling it revisionary editions. This will include things like 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy role-playing.
Arguably 10th edition Warhammer 40,000 right now could fit into that.
Sure.
But it would be a reference point to an edition that forgoes the iterative process of the prior editions, some of the traditions involved per se, and strikes out on something new. And there are cases where this can be successfully implemented. And we're going to argue that this is probably one of those better examples, whereas the famous poor example is 3rd edition of Fantasy Roleplay Warhammer, where the community was so they were just so embraced in their one way of playing the game that this new way that came out with all this additional work you had to do and all these additional components, it just really didn't work for the community. It was a cool game. Like I actually collected a lot of that game and really enjoyed it for what it was, but it wasn't the same thing by any means.
We could go on and on about how it didn't work, but it didn't deliver on the same fantasy that the previous edition sold.
Yes, agree.
Liked. It had less of that ordinary people in a terrible world rising up.
Mm-hmm.
It was really board gamey by comparison.
Yeah, more so than any of the other Genesis titles, for sure.
More so than this game, for sure.
Yeah.
And its setting could support that, but it didn't necessarily do that in the execution because it tried to fulfill this broader fantasy of what Warhammer Fantasy is and not try to do what they did with this game, which is to narrow in on a particular aspect of it.
Yes.
Which I would argue is the idea of playing a minor noble, or in the sort of the equivalent of playing a knight, in this case a samurai. Yeah, when we get into the character creation and the rules, it'll make a bit more sense. But one of the major disadvantages to the picto dice method, the symbol system, is that each roll is super significant. It almost tells you in way more detail than other pass-fail systems how things played out. And so you can pick up off of that and role play from that. But it takes a long time to figure out what happened with that one roll.
Yes.
And for a game that you kind of consider to be high octane action, it really throws the brakes on when you have to check to see, oh, well, how many advantages and how many sort of sub advantages and how many negatives, and do they cancel each other out? And then what does that mean?
Yeah.
Some games did a better job of defining what those outcomes were. Two of the Star Wars games did a good job of giving you good definitions, or even having the ability to spend for effect.
Yeah.
Which games like some Free League games like Forbidden Lands and Alien have this same idea, where multiple successes or higher levels of success can mean purchasing, in some sense, better outcomes or additional effects. But in the case of earlier attempts, or even if you look at the Genesis system more generically, it's super vague. And that can work if it's a more narratively driven game where the one dice roll means, like, instead of it being moment to moment, that one dice roll could be the whole combat.
Yes.
I know that's a weird thing to imagine, but if one round of combat was the whole combat, this type of system works better. That's not exactly what happens in this edition of L5R, but I think it comes closer to realizing that idea.
100%. And this edition, even though it was relatively short-lived in terms of its official supported time, it did get additional materials such as supplements, published adventures, all that type of stuff. You can buy fancy dice. There's a dice app for it. So all that's available. It also did get novelizations, audiobooks. There was a board game. So there's, and of course the LCG that ran. So there was a lot of support for the setting of L5R at the end of the 2010s. And it has had a dedicated fan base dating back to the 90s. Like, this game keeps getting revised. Someone out there really wants this to succeed. So they keep coming back to this.
Like with a lot of revisionary editions, the majority of the core fan base are skeptical, even rejecting of it. And that is true of this. Some people still like playing 4th edition. And 4th edition, as far as the original rule set, is probably the most refined.
Yes.
It's a beautiful book. It stands on par with this edition as far as its production and the layout of its lore and all of these other elements. But there are dedicated people who still like this game because it does appeal to some people as far as having, maybe it's more niche, but having that more drama-based rolling mechanic and having the other mechanisms of the game tap into that in a meaningful way has kept some people at least intrigued. I know that, Troy, you still think that this is, like, you haven't played any other version of this?
I have not. No, this is my version of L5R, and out of no disrespect to the prior editions, this is definitely the way I see myself engaging with it. I also do have adventures in Rokugan, the 5e version of this game, or the 5e version of this setting, I should probably better state it. And I love that. I think it's very cool. But this is the real Legend of Five Rings by my estimation. And these pictographic dice work really great with the theme, the setting, and what you can do with your characters and the drama of your story. It is very much a story-based game, so it doesn't necessarily support the same degree of sandboxery, you might get in other titles or, stuff like that. But man, can you tell the coolest stories with this? And it's unique as well for the fact that the storyline was also progressed by Fantasy Flight Games in the LCG as well as in the published adventures for the role-playing game. So they did advance the story where, I guess I won't give the spoiler, but there was a change that happens that throws the clans into conflict, which is kind of what you want. You want the clans to be at each other's throats for the most interplay to happen. And it was really cool to see that this game had that element of its past, of the player generated story through those, tournaments. There was a little bit of that here. It wasn't quite the same open-endedness, but the players still were given an opportunity to play along with a developing story, which was quite cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the actual quality and printing of the book, this is like, as I alluded, the previous edition is also really well developed and well made. But this edition, like a lot of FFG products, is full color printing, double column. The font is a little small, and there's certain things about it where, like the font type, I didn't actually try to figure out what the font type was, but it can be a little hard to read at times, but it's laid out so well that there's not that much struggle with it. And of all the books that we've done reviews on and all the systems we've done, this is probably the first one where it has annotated margins.
Yeah.
Again, nothing new nowadays, but making use of the reference columning on the side to basically say, I think the most of the time in role-playing games, this is used to guide players and, well, not players, but readers into other areas of the book where there might be other details. So it's like a synopsis that's commentating on something referenced on that page. But it's basically a margin with notes in it. And it's super useful. Some people argue it clutters up the page, but I think it depends on what you're going for.
Yeah.
I think in a case of a game that's rule heavy, it's super helpful. Yeah, and as I said, clear, albeit small text, and nice, airy layouts, beautiful art, good depiction of... So when you're doing a Pictodice system, you're going to have to identify what dice, usually using symbols, and they actually do a good job of making those fairly readable. So the D6s that you use are marked with a black square, and the I think they're
D12.
The D12s are marked with a pentagon.
Yeah.
A white pentagon. And compared to other, like I have Genesis dice in a jar somewhere. There's a lot of different dice in there, and it gets a little bit noodly regarding like which ones do I roll and what do all these symbols mean.
Yeah.
This one does a good job of just kind of keeping it to the two.
Yeah.
And then having essentially 4 symbols.
You got your success, your explosive success, where you get to add additional dice to your pool. And then you have your opportunity and your strife. Those are your 4 faces, or your 4 symbols that can be on your faces, in addition to a blank face. And what happens is when you roll this, you roll based on your ring and your skill. So this is based on the attributes of your character. And when you roll your number of dice, your total number, you are going to only get to keep a fixed number. So there will be discarded dice. And there, in the prior editions of this game, there was a raise mechanic where you could like wager and risk to get more. And in this edition, they've done away with that. But you are in effect still making a similar choice, because you do have to engage with the fact that you might have 2 successes on 1 dice, but you'll also have 2 strife. So are you going to take on the strife to get the success? Is it worth the risk? Or do you want to take a less successful outcome with less strife, but maybe has an opportunity facing? So there's a degree of interaction with the dice that's really interesting. But as we alluded to earlier, it's going to add time to the resolution of that dice roll.
So there's still a wagering element. It's just been shifted more into that roll and keep style system. So, and the idea that strife accumulates, that's more about where you make those decisions as to which dice you end up keeping within the roll. So, characters. What can we say about the characters? So, as I had mentioned before, you're playing, well, there are ways of playing lower class characters, or presumably higher echelons of the society. You're typically playing, I guess what could be argued, a mid-level noble.
I would say so. Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction.
Now that might seem limiting in some respects, because you're like, well, like what, how do I play the rogue type, and how do I, play these other, but I mean, when we get to other elements of the game, it's clear that they're trying to disabuse you of thinking in terms of D&D, which I think is to its advantage.
Yeah.
But it probably would be a bit of a shift for some people. But the idea is you can still play a ninja effectively, or a spy, You're also still a high-ranking member of a noble court, and that does color how you think of your character and how you play the game. As I said, there's ways of playing lower-level characters. You can have that more peasant feel, but the way the game is aimed at you with the core rules is more about playing these characters of station that have sway politically, if maybe only a little bit, and are hands-on.
Yes, absolutely. It's like you may be a character that is in fights and does draw their sword, but they also have social responsibilities that they are obligated to maintain. And you don't always have to draw your sword, but even if you are a combat character like a Bushi, you still will have that other element to you. And I think that makes every character more rounded. Like if you want to play a shinobi, like we were just discussing, you absolutely can. And it will give you that roguelike background. But there is more to your character than just being like a cut purse or a pickpocket. You know, there's an entire element to the society that you're a part of. And part of how this is determined is there's a 20 questions process to figuring out who your character is and creating your character. So what you do is you go through and you do part 1, the core identity of clan and family. That's where you determine your clan and your family name. This will be your basic first attributes that you're picking, and they'll really determine a huge amount of where you fit into the world and what your role is going to be. Because in addition to picking your, I guess, class, for lack of a better term, or your career, you'll also have your clan. And the different clans can do, like every clan has every type of thing underneath it, but they each specialize in the type of samurai and character that make up the clan.
I usually like to describe this to people as what is the ambition of your character is very much determined by what clan you pick.
Yes.
And that's determined by the lore. So there's this nice knitting together of these different elements. So to take a maybe not a fully random example, but the Crab Clan is very much focused on fighting the Tainted Lands, which they're territory neighbors, and they are more focused on external threats. And to describe the Shadowlands, the Shadow Taint is basically like karmic radiation that causes all kinds of terrible things like Oni and zombies and ghouls and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This is like an external encroaching thing. It's kind of like in Game of Thrones, like north of the wall kind of thing, where that's the bad place where people can't live and there's all kinds of horrible things out there.
Yes.
And that tells you in a very broad sense what your character is going to be raised in believing to be the main concern with life in Rokugan. Troy, you're a big fan of Dragon?
Yeah, I love Dragon Clan in the North.
Yeah.
They're more esoteric and they have more of a mysterious mandate, where Crab Clan their job is the wall, south of the wall, the Shadowlands, and keeping that at bay. So they're very practical, pragmatic. They're focused on things that'll further their tactical and strategic advantage in their fight against the Shadowlands. Whereas Dragon Clan, they are way more concerned with philosophical pursuits, which just makes them so interesting to engage with. And you'll find Dragon Clan people sent as mediators to other parts of the Empire, but no one will be able to really discern whose end game they're serving at the, ultimately, because they're just mysterious in this fundamental way that makes them very intriguing and satisfying as characters.
There's also a bunch of minor clans.
Yes.
I guess everyone's favorite is probably Mantis.
Yeah, pirates.
Yeah, they're pirates that live on the little collection of islands off the shore. And then going the other way, there is the Imperial clan, or the Imperial house.
Yeah.
Which acts as a kind of mediator in a lot of ways. And they're often it's weird to think of an entire clan as being a quest giver, but in a lot of cases, they're the ones that instigate action.
Yeah, they do. It's by their decree or by the limitations they set on the greater clans or lesser clans, minor clans, that a lot of them, the action is drawn from. Like There's a great short story I'm reading right now wherein there is a great clan that has a holding taken by a minor clan. And there's imperial decree that you cannot, as a greater clan, attack a minor clan. So it becomes this political game of intrigue to get this territory back without resorting to an outright attack and all the drama that unfolds from that. And it's so cool. And it does a great job of highlighting that you can do things both with a closed fist, but also with an open palm.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this requirement to engage with both facets of that to solve any one problem. And you're absolutely right. The Imperial House is sort of going to be one of the instigators to these problems, whether they're trying to solve something or they've made a decision that's now created a fresh problem.
One of the major things that makes this game different from other role-playing games is the scope in which your characters have influence, which is social, political, economic, and militaristic.
Yeah.
Even if it's just down to the level of like two characters dueling over, a slight of honor or something like that, the ramifications of that can be quite broad. So another aspect of this game, which is I think is super cool.
Yeah.
Mostly for its innovative, and it is an iterative element. It's something that has been passed down from earlier editions. So this isn't something that this edition of the game came up with, though they definitely made it more abstract or broadened its effect, are the, I guess what you can call core characteristics equivalent in other games. So this would be things like your strength, dexterity, constitution, but this game does not measure those things in that way. I wouldn't say necessarily at all, but it completely recontextualizes this by having the core characteristics of a character be the 5 rings, which are effectively like 5 elements.
Yes.
Now, funnily enough, these are not the East Asian versions of these. These are actually more like Western elements. It's funny. There's a parallel here with Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yes,
because they do the same thing, but it still works. So you have air, earth, fire, water, and void. And the way that these really differ from your typical attributes, characteristics, ability scores, whatever you want to call them, is that they don't neatly map onto those things in other games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's more evocative or suggestive, and you might think, oh, well, air is like about agility and finesse, and that is what it's applied to. But the idea is that you can apply that ring to any situation to color how you would be dealing with it. So it's not necessarily all physical stuff. It's physical, social, mental, all in one that are themed around that element. And that can be really hard for maybe not new players, but players used to role-playing games doing things that are more, I want to say, more of a specific quality of your character, as opposed to this, which feels more spiritual. There's something very Taoist about its interpretation.
It's that kind of more philosophical angle in that you're not a strength 10, intelligence 15. It's your fire is your strength. Yes, but it's how you apply your strength as much as water is your strength. But how do you apply it differently when viewed through this lens? So if you have to break down a door, fire can do it and water can do it, but it's how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like fire could just be this barrage of ferocious strikes as you just bash and pound this door down, eventually kicking it off its hinges. Where water might be a swell, a concentration of power, and a single efficient blow that just knocks the door flat. And both achieve the same outcome.
Yeah.
And you might even ask, like, what's the distinction? I got through the door. But it's the way in which you apply these rings and apply the skills together that creates the narrative of your character. And that defines who you are. The way that you use air and earth, water, fire, and void makes the character have a presence in the game world that I think is so cool and goes beyond simply being like, I'm the fast one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I like to think of it as like an action prompt. So in a way that like your GM at your table, you say, oh, I hit the guy, and then you prompted with how do you do that? Like what is your actual action? Obviously wanting you to give more detail to make the game more interesting. This game, using the 5 rings, immediately suggests that if you can choose to use any ring to apply to any situation, but it immediately suggests how you do that. And the prompt from your GM is like, okay, you're using air to get through this door. What do? Oh, it's like, well, I find the locking mechanism, and then it's effectively like picking a lock.
Yes, 100%.
And as I said, it's more broadly evocative than necessarily this super specific way of determining this plus I don't want to make a philosophical argument that I don't have the know-how to do, but this game in its approach feels more like Eastern philosophy, whereas the strength, dexterity, constitution feel more like a Western view of the world and its mechanics.
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. And I think that is something that is worth thinking about when you play this game, is like, it's both a different setting, but it's a different way of looking at the same experience of role playing. You know what I mean? Like, you're not just collecting numbers like some other games can be reduced down to. In this game, and that's not a bad thing at all.
Yeah.
But I just mean to say that in this game, even though you're still achieving the same result, the way you go about achieving that result is just as significant as the fact that you got it or didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And there are certainly parallels where, again, because the game is about making a justification or, in some sense, wagering how an outcome will go, it might make more sense to use a certain element. Like, if you're going to take a hit from somebody, earth is probably a good argument.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stand like a stone and take it. Whereas if you, say, took air, then you would evade that hit. Or water might be more evasive, or being able to like bend around that and maybe parry them.
Absorb it, right? Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly.
And fire, you just like freaking counter-strike the guy.
Yeah, you're just stepping right into them before they can make any move at all. And each one suggests a different situation. Now, the one that we haven't talked about is void. And the best way to describe void in this case is the ineffable, the metaphysic, luck.
Yep. It has a lot to do with the magic as well, in addition to luck, yes.
Yeah. There are even void points, which tie more into the magic system. But yeah, it's more of that extra something that isn't present in those four other elements, but is still on equal footing with them. So if you solve a problem with void, it means that you use a sort of like, do I know something and I use void? You're trying to determine this through intuition and less about reasoned thinking or, strong-headedness or cleverness. It's more of like, if I clear my mind of everything, what's the first thing I realize?
And when you're building a character, you are in a way picking your favorite rings. You're statting them as you go along to what you're most embracing of. For me, I like my core character I built for this game is water and void, because I wanted someone who was like adaptable, but also mysterious. Like, I went full Dragon Clan with them. You know what I mean? Like, I really went in on that theme of someone who was like adaptable, but changeable. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really compelling. Do you have two that you pick that you would pick for a character that you would like assemble?
So no, I know from the character that I made that character was fire and earth.
Nice.
So it was a very passionate, stubborn jerk. Much like me. It was interesting going through that process where I kind of like, okay, I kind of get how these two rings work. I'm going to try and build it around, as you said, that pairing. And it worked. As I went through, it's like, oh man, this character makes more and more sense every time I add a new element to them in the character creation process. I don't know how to describe it, but these characters have a vibe that might only happen with other role-playing games as you play them. That also kind of runs the risk that is this the character creation game? Yeah, it might sometimes feel like that. But I think it's also important to establish characters as having this lineage and history and connection into the world more so in this game than, say, Dungeons and Dragons, where you might just be a ragtag misfit group of adventurers going out and solving or causing problems.
Yes.
You're still solving and causing problems in this world, but you have these connections to all of these other people, and you have responsibilities, and there's honor to think about, and glory, and your true intentions versus the duty that you put in front of you. Like, it's a game of constraints.
Yeah.
Arguably every good game is a game of constraints, but the constraints are very apparent to you. And the fun of the game is navigating those things. And so when you get into this, you really want to have that in mind. You know, if you're going to play this, this is one of my arguments about why this isn't a good game, is because the buy-in is so heavy. I don't know if there's a way, like, hopefully us describing it and making it sound as good as we can will get people interested in playing. But just know that to play this game, to, like, at least for me personally, to feel like I'm playing it correctly, I have to digest a lot of stuff. I have to take on a lot of concepts that I'm not familiar with. And it gets involved.
It's a high investment game. It is, because the setting is very specific, very detailed, and very rich. The mechanics are not following stated convention a lot of the time. A lot of the time it's very novel in their approach to things. And there's, like, to the game's credit and to the game's advantage, there are 3 different combat resolution systems. However, there are 3 different combat resolution systems.
Yeah.
So it's like, there's a lot that you're grokking with when you're taking this game on, and there's a reason I've only got it to table the one time. But it's so satisfying and is so cool. Like, you have honor and glory, which is part of your social, tracking. You also have status to represent your rank in this society. And that's like key parts of your character. But the 2 parts of your character creation we haven't really touched on yet that I really like are the Ninjō and your Giri. The Ninjō is your character's personal desire. That's their sort of like what motivates them internally, while the Giri is their social duty, their duty to their lord or to the people around them. And the way this game really sings is when those are sort of opposing each other in a rewarding fashion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, that's sort of that other idea that makes the game a commitment to get into, is that the lore, and maybe more accurately, the themes, tie into the mechanics really directly. And yeah, you having these ideas of what your personal desire is and what your social duty might be. So, I need to be seen as the leader of this group, but at the same time, I secretly long for, what's a good counter to that? I long for personal validation. Like I don't think I'm good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't go to the people that I lead and get that from them. So I'm going to have to find a way to fulfill that part of my character through some other character. And then that can tie in things like if your character is courting someone or has a wife or a husband, and whether they're able to navigate those different social roles in a way that's appropriate. And then strife throws a wrench into the middle of that.
Exactly. Strife will make you question your Giri, make you dive for your Ninjō at the wrong moment. And there's also this heavy presence of the Bushido code. It's not a 1-for-1 to the real Bushido code. It's kind of like Pendragon and Chivalry, if you know the reference I'm making.
Yeah. Pendragon is a really good reference point for this game, because I think the 2 games have something similar. But in this case, it's more about honor and duty. And whereas Pendragon is more about duty and destiny.
Yeah, Pendragon, there's a certain like fated path to you, where in L5R, you kind of do have that, because one of the cooler elements of your character creation, we didn't mention this, but I want to grab this quick, is at the end of your 20 questions, as you define yourself, the 20th question is, how does your character die? And this is something to think about in consideration with your game master, but in many ways, it's like showing you the end, like letting you have a bit of control at the end. Like, do they die in service to their lord? Is it in an act of rebellion? And it doesn't have to be like, they took 36 damage from an Oni. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's about the thematic reason of their death, not the specific context for it.
Yeah, as I say, the Bushido in this is maybe a truncated version of actual Bushido code, and it makes it easier to follow for players. I think it's a bit more streamlined to represent more of the mechanics, but it's a fantasy setting, so we're not going for historical accuracy when it's not necessary. And it's a great tie into the conflicts of the game, which are these, I like to think of them as sort of like dramatic scenes that play out as the narrative progresses. And there's a lot more impact in what happens. So these are things like duels, skirmishes, so that's your combat aspect. But then you've got intrigue. You might have to lead battles where there's sort of, I want to say that, like, you can be good at a tea ceremony or playing an instrument in a certain context, and that can mean as much as your ability to wield a sword.
Yes.
And it's not so far off to have the character that wields a sword be this amazing musician at the same time, or a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Those work well. In fact, I think the character I made had like really high etiquette.
That's awesome.
But was also kind of like, a brick house of a fighter as well.
My guy is like a Go player, like the game Go. So he's like using Void to like be like inscrutable with his moves in Go. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's a perfect way to explain about how different aspects of the game call down from those rings. It's like, oh, well, we're playing instruments, or I'm demonstrating my musical ability, and I choose Earth as my focus, and that makes it so that like I'm right on time, pitch perfect. It's not super creative, but it's very like fundamentally correct.
Super technical. Yeah.
Yeah, as if you chose water, it might have these improvised flourishes.
And if you chose fire, you just go on a solo.
It's passion. It's just like, yeah, that wanky guitar solo.
So it's so cool what these rings do, and like the different types of encounters and conflicts you're in, and choosing the different rings at the different times means that you're never really in a case where you're just going to say like, yeah, I punch him again, roll 20. Like there's a lot of different choices you're making, and implementing the rings, choosing the skills and techniques, because there's a whole range of techniques, both magical and mundane, for unarmed combat, armed combat, summoning creatures, doing the Shugenja, pardon me. They use Void to communicate with spirits.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do a lot of sort of ethereal types of magic as well. And again, this is all rooted through picking these rings. And you can come up with sort of like your optimized choices based on your rings. Like, I'm a water guy, so I choose water a lot. But there are times where you're going to want to use the opposing rings, where different techniques or skills will require it of you. Like you might have something that starts off with like fire ring. So okay, I have to come at this a certain way to execute this technique. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to consider, and that's why this is perhaps more of a complicated game than other role-playing games that you might sit your eyes on. But I'm firmly of the opinion that you get out of your hobby what you put into it, and this is a game that you invest heavily in, but it pays you back.
For sure. Do you want to give like the really short version of the lore of the world? Because we're coming up on the time here. But
yeah, I'd love to.
I do want to get a little bit of as the sort of 1,000-mile up view down.
Yeah, let's give it from the top. So the Legend of Five Rings is set, as we've said, in Rokugan. This is a land inspired by feudal Japan. However, instead of being set on an island in an archipelago, it's a continental setting with an archipelago down the coast. So it's a little bit of a different topography, but it's a land populated by samurai, courtiers, monks, Shugenja, and the lords and peasants both above and below them. There are complex political and militaristic situations breaking out because the clans both are like legally required not to be at war, but are also entirely at war. So you have this situation where Lion Clan, like the mean guys, the tough guys on the street, they're going to go out and they're going to like crack some skulls. And that's how they're going to try and go about solving their problems. So they're going to try and create casus belli and justifications for their violence. Whereas Scorpion Clan, they're the masters of intrigue. They're shinobi and spies, and they're going to use assassination. And they'll just have a lord found dead. And oh, wow, how did that happen? What a tragedy. But of course, Scorpion was involved. So there's all these different situations that are happening through the great clans. And there are 7 of them. And we've mentioned a few of them so far, but it pays just to kind of run down the list. You have Crab in the south, protecting the southern border on the wall. You have Crane on the coast, who represent perhaps the most refined of the clans, or at least that's how they would see themselves. In the far north, in the mountains, you have Dragon. Dragon take a lot of influence from sort of out of the game world from Chinese philosophy and Chinese mysticism as well. So they stand a little bit apart from the other great clans. And in the history of the setting, the leader of Dragon Clan at the origin point of the world sort of was apart from his kin as well. You have Lion Clan that's in the center of the region. They are sort of the warriors, the most aggressive and violent, but they're also very proud and honorable. Phoenix Clan is in the northwest. They would represent the magical. They are obsessed with the study of magic and the spiritual realm, and that is hugely their focus. Scorpion, we've talked about. They're also centrally located as well, but you do see them everywhere. And they're kind of like sanctioned bad guys in a hilarious way. Like, a lot of the bad things that happen in Rokugan is their fault. But it's almost like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Yeah.
So let's make them part of our society as opposed to banishing them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they fall into that trope. They are their House Slytherin.
Their House Slytherin for sure.
It's like, why are you part of society?
So it's kind of hilarious.
Oh, because there's worse things out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the last of the clans is sort of maybe the smallest of the great clans, but the Unicorn. And they take a lot from steppe culture. And they're horse riders and experts of overland travel. And they are the most unique in the sense that they will accept outsiders and new traditions and integrate them into their own culture, without the same level of conservatism that the other clans have, where they sort of protect their traditions in a more aggressive fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got these great clans. Then there are the minor clans. There is a number of them, and they all serve secondary functions to the greater clans. So you've got Mantis Clan, there's Tortoise Clan. There are a number of different types of clans out there that are doing still important things, but not quite the same like nation-defining roles that the great clans have. Like we mentioned before, Mantis are the pirates, and they do a lot of maritime trade, travel, but also they will do like privateering, so to speak, where we'll call it liberating the goods of other great clans if they catch them at sea. And where this all comes from is the Kami and the Celestial Order. So these ruling families of Rokugan are descendants of the Kami, divine beings who descended to create the land, create Rokugan. The Celestial Order dictates the hierarchy of existence that is followed from the Emperor down all the way to peasants and to the outcasts of society. So that's another reference to how strict and uniform this setting is in terms of who belongs where in the world. It's why your characters do have a defined role of being a mid-level noble. And you can, of course, change that. But because what that place in society affords you to do, it's almost like the most flexible position you could be. The higher you are in the social order, the more tied down you are by your obligations and responsibilities and less able to leave them. And then the lower you are in the social order, it's almost the same thing. It's like a horseshoe, whereas you're also not really able to leave your responsibilities. But as you're in this middle ground, you may be dispatched on errand. And that's kind of where this game lives in. As you are these mid-level nobles, sometimes from one clan, sometimes from a collage of clans, and you'll be put together for a task. As we've implied, it could be an imperial task. It might be solving a problem relevant to the clans that's just spontaneously come to being, like an attack from the Shadowlands, or it could be one clan versus another. But this background is kind of what pins that all together.
Oh, and yeah, so the Shadowlands are the kind of X factor. And as I said, there's a near parallel with Game of Thrones, let's say, where there's this impending doom force that exists outside of the known kingdoms, and it adds this level of pressure that different clans consider to be a threat at sort of different levels.
Mm-hmm. Like Crab takes it super serious.
Yeah, and arguably Phoenix takes it seriously, but in a more abstract way, because they're the spiritual clan. You can have your entire campaign be about fighting the Shadowlands and fighting its influence. But this is essentially where you end up with the horror element of the game. You end up with your dark spirits, ghosts, demons, that element. And it all comes out of this sort of southern corrupted area that is constantly adding this pressure onto the world. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of detail even within each clan. And as I said, like, this is now 5.5 editions in. So, you know, we couldn't possibly explain it all. So we'll probably just call it there and say that this is the 5th edition of L5R, but really a broad taking of the entire setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a way, like if you want to get into L5R and you don't want to learn Picto Dice, you can play Adventures in Rokugan, or you can play 4th edition. And both of those will give you rewarding looks at this world. If you're like me and you've played a lot of the Star Wars RPG or a lot of Genesis in general, and you're familiar with these dice, this is a natural extension of it and probably the best version of that dice system that's going. And I would love to see more people playing L5R. I think it's an awesome game, an awesome setting. There's a lot to grab onto. And yeah, let us know in the comments if you've ever got this to table, any of the previous editions, anything like that. We'd love to talk more about it. And it's kind of funny. Like, it's such a rich game, so much to it, but there's not a lot of content out there on it. So let us know if you want to hear more.
Yeah. No, there's definitely, I've noticed a dearth of lore on this that is specifically dedicated in a way that, like, say Warhammer or even Dungeons and Dragons lore for that matter. So yeah, let us know if there's any channels out there that we, you know, that are digging into this. That would be great. So yeah, next week we are talking about dice and resolution mechanics in a whole range of games.
Yeah, dice, components.
Mostly focused around different core dice systems, but we will be talking about other things, including systems that don't use dice, that are more drama systems, or ones that use Picto Dice like this. So yeah, tune in and we'll be getting way more into that. But until then, happy gaming.
Have a great one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.